go from here to here, from the low pressure to the high pressure. Now we call these perforating veins. If I can extend this diagram a little bit, the muscle here. They're called perforating veins because they perforate the muscle fascia. So the muscle here carries on, and the perforating veins perforates the muscle fascia. Now, the pressure here is high and the pressure here is low. So the blood will tend to flow from high pressure to low pressure. But what happens is after the muscle has contracted and squashed the high pressure deep vein, the blood goes back up towards absolutely scoots back up towards the centre of the body. And can you see that that means now that the deep vein is going to be closed because it's just been compressed? That means that for a short period of time the pressure in the deep vein is actually quite low. So we have a situation now where the pressure in the deep vein is low and the pressure in the superficial vein is higher because this vein has had time to fill up. So after muscle contraction, after the deep vein has been emptied, then there's an opportunity for blood to flow from the superficial venous system to the deep venous system. Once it's in the deep venous system, if there's another muscle contraction, that blood can then be very efficiently returned to the heart. Now, I think I'll show you a demonstration of this now. Now, I'm not sure how well this is going to work, but what we have here is a tube with water in it. So let's imagine this is the tube, is the vein. The water, of course, is the blood. And these pieces of wood are the muscle. So this is a deep vein because it's going through the muscle. Now, at the moment, the muscle is relaxed, so nothing's happening. But watch what happens when I contract the muscle. Well, we get venous return. And then when the muscle relaxes, the pressure is relatively low in here, so more water could then be sucked in from the superficial veins. So here we see the muscle and the muscle fascia and the deep vein going through. When the muscle's relaxed, the vein is not compressed. But then when the muscle contracts, it gets shorter and fatter. The muscle fascia prevent excessive outward movement of the muscle. Therefore, because the muscle is shorter and fatter, it displaces inwards and it compresses the vein with the effect that we've just seen on the demonstration. Now it's interesting to note one of the effects if there is any pathology or damage to these veins. So here we have the deep vein as before, here we have the communicating or perforating vein, and here we have the superficial vein. Now remember, in the normal physiological situation, the blood is supposed to go from the superficial vein to the deep vein to be returned to the centre. But in this case, there's been damage to these valves in the perforating vein, and that means that blood is now able to flow, because fluids go from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. Blood is able to flow from the area of high pressure in this vein back into the low pressure system. And this results in the low pressure veins being engorged with blood. That means there's chronic pressure on the valves in the low pressure system, and over time this chronic pressure will cause the valves to become non-functional. There will be damage to the valves. This results in tortuous, dilated peripheral veins. And this, of course, is the condition we call varicose veins. Now it's interesting to note what can happen if there is a failure of the functioning of these valves. So here as before we have the deep vein in the muscle, we have the perforating or communicator vein, and we have the superficial vein up and down here. Now if these valves fail, they become diseased and no longer function as valves. This means that blood from the high pressure system, and remember of course fluids always travel from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure, that blood from the high pressure system is able to flow towards the low pressure superficial veins. In normal physiology, of course, the blood flows from the superficial veins to the deep veins. Here it's the other way around. This is a pathological condition. And that means that the superficial veins become engorged with blood at relatively high pressures. This causes the superficial veins to dilate, and they become tortuous and dilated. Of course, we call this condition varicose veins. Over time, the valve here, which is under a level of pressure now from the high pressure blood that it was not really designed to withstand, eventually this valve will fail, and the varicose vein can then extend downwards. Over time, this valve may fail, and you end up with these tortuous, dilated superficial veins. I'm sure you've all seen varicose veins. Now most people are fairly comfortable with the idea that if there is a reduced arterial blood supply, then the tissues will be embarrassed. There's not enough blood getting to the tissues, they'll be ischemic. Now by tissue embarrassment, I mean that the tissue is not receiving the oxygen and the nutrients it requires for its normal metabolic processes. By tissue embarrassment, I mean that the tissue is not able to dispose of its waste products normally, which can accumulate in the tissues. So when a tissue is embarrassed, it's not getting its nutrients and oxygen, it's not getting rid of its waste products. In other words, the conditions for its metabolic processes are going to be poor. So arterial disease, most people don't have too much of a difficulty with that concept. But with venous disease, the same is true. If there is a reduced venous drainage due to venous pathology, then there will be a venous insufficiency. And venous insufficiency can also give rise to tissue embarrassment. Now, if the venous system is not working properly because it's diseased, then can you see that's going to reduce the effectiveness of venous return? Venous return will be compromised. And what this means in practice is that there is an accumulation of blood in the venous system. Now, if there's an accumulation of blood in the venous system, what is that going to do to the pressure of blood in those veins? Well, if there's an accumulation of blood, the pressure in the veins is going to be increased. And this is going to give rise to a venous hypertension, an increased pressure of blood in the venous system. So, venous pathology can result in chronic venous hypertension. Chronic venous hypertension. And this will embarrass the tissues. And to understand this, we need to think back to capillaries. And we also need to understand the process of osmosis to some degree as well. Now, I don't propose to spend a lot of time on the normal physiology. If you enjoy this type of video learning, then video number 1 in this series goes into detail on capillary physiology. And video number 15 in this series goes into great detail on the principles of osmosis and diffusion. But let's think about a capillary and then try and work out what is going on and explain how that can result in chronic venous hypertension, or rather how the chronic venous hypertension can affect the capillary. So let's first of all think about a capillary. Remember, a capillary is a tube, hollow tube, very small diameters, maybe as small as 7 micrometers across. And it's made up of individual squamous epithelial cells, actually endothelial cells. So a capillary is something like this. Each cell has its own nucleus, and there are small gaps between some of the cells that comprise the capillary. Not all the cells are tightly packed together. So here we have a capillary, and the blood cells will go through the capillary. Sometimes, only one at a time, these capillaries can be very narrow. Remember, blood cells are biconcave discs, so they're darker on the outside, lighter on the inside. And the capillaries, of course, go through tissues. And a tissue is a group of cells. So around about here, there are the cells that the capillary exists to perfuse. These dark bits in the middle are the cell nuclei. So you've got a nucleus, some cytoplasm, cell membrane. Here we have the tissue. Of course, the cells and the tissues aren't dry, they're moist, they contain tissue fluid. So the cells are bathed in tissue fluid. Now the tissue fluid forms from the plasma at the arterial end of the capillary because the blood pressure is greater than the osmotic pressure. So there's a pressure of blood in the arterial end of the capillary. Different figures, maybe 32 millimeters of mercury, say. And that's tending to force fluid out. Remember, the plasma, of course, has got water in it. So because the blood pressure here is greater than the osmotic pressure trying to hold the water in. Tissue fluid is exuded at the arterial end of the capillary. So the blood's coming in from this way, from the arterial. And it's leaving that way towards the venule. Do you remember what it is that generates the osmotic pressure of the plasma? Well, the osmotic pressure of the plasma is generated largely by the presence of very large molecules in the plasma called the plasma proteins. Albumin, globulin, fibrinogen, plasma proteins. So there's plasma proteins in here, big molecules, generating osmotic pressure. And of course the osmotic pressure will tend to suck the water back in. Now as you go along the capillary, the pressure drops because of course the pressure in veins, where this is going, is lower than the pressure in arteries, where this has come from. So at the venous end of the capillary, the blood pressure, the hydrostatic pressure is lower. And normally in health this means that the osmotic pressure sucking water back in is now greater than the hydrostatic pressure trying to push it back out. So that means tissue fluid is reabsorbed at the venous end of the capillary. That is normal. But what I want to do now is talk about the effects of chronic venous hypertension. Now the first point is quite simple really. If this blood is unable to get out, can you see that means that the amount of blood that gets in is also going to be reduced. That means that the transit of blood through the capillary is going to be slowed down. So there'll be a reduced blood flow. The oxygen for these cells comes from the red cells. The glucose for the metabolism of these cells comes from the plasma. So I think you can see if the flow of blood is slowed down, then there'll be a reduction in the amount of oxygen and nutrients these cells receive. There'll also be a reduction in the rate at which they can excrete their waste products back into the blood for removal. So some tissue embarrassment can be caused just because there's a reduced blood flow, because there is a restricted venous outflow. But there's another factor. If the pressure here is higher, the pressure at the venous end of the capillary is higher, what's that going to do to the amount of tissue fluid which is reabsorbed? Well, if the pressure here is higher, can you see that's going to reduce the amount of water that's reabsorbed? Because water is reabsorbed at the venous end of the capillary in health because the osmotic pressure is greater than the blood pressure. So the blood pressure here has probably dropped to something like 14 millimetres of mercury. In health, the osmotic pressure is going to be something like 26 millimetres of mercury. But if you increase the blood pressure here, you're going to take away the difference between the hydrostatic pressure and the osmotic pressure. That will mean that the osmotic pressure is no longer sufficient to overcome the increased hydrostatic pressure. So in chronic venous hypertension, there's going to be less fluid reabsorbed into the venous end of the capillary. And that's going to increase the amount of tissue fluid. So in chronic venous hypertension, you're going to have increased amounts of tissue fluid. What do we call it if there's an increased amount of tissue fluid? Well, a collection of fluid in the tissues, of course, is edema. There's going to be swelling. So there's going to be reduced blood flow, and there's also going to be edema. Now, if there's more fluid in the tissue, Can you see that means there's more fluid that the oxygen has to diffuse through to get from here in the cells to the tissue cell where it is required for metabolism?